Winter hit Chicago's South Side like an old curse no one bothered to break, dirty snow piling thick on cracked sidewalks, while the wind cut through every dark alley, as if the city itself was trying to push out anyone who couldn't afford to stay. Inside the leaking basement apartment at the end of Halsted Street, Meredith Ashford, 27, dark brown hair pulled back in a hurried knot, deep shadows bruising beneath her gray-blue eyes, pressed a glass of warm water to her brother's lips and waited for Knox to swallow the pill. He was 17, his skin ashen from the dialysis session that had ended 3 hours ago, curled up on the threadbare sofa under 2 layered jackets, because the heater had died last week and nobody was coming to fix it. Mara pulled her hand from Knox's forehead once she was sure he'd fallen asleep, then stood, her back straight, even though every muscle in her body wanted to collapse after 12 hours of folding laundry at the dry cleaners. On the kitchen counter, under a fluorescent light flickering toward its last breath, she saw the things that had been waiting for her every night. A $47,000 hospital bill folded in half and shoved beneath a chipped mug so the draft wouldn't blow it away. A power shutoff notice effective Friday, and one last packet of instant noodles she'd given Knox for dinner, instead of eating it herself. Mara squeezed her own wrist, an old habit whenever fear crept in, and felt beneath her fingers the sharp ridges of tendons belonging to someone who couldn't remember when she'd last had a meal of her own. Then the knocking came slow, steady, patient. 3 knocks at 3 in the morning, and Mara froze where she stood, because on the South Side, nobody knocked at that hour carrying good news. If this opening's already got you hooked, hit that like button so more people can find this story. Share it with someone who loves a good drama, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Mara opens that door. Mara stood motionless in front of the door for 3 long breaths before her hand touched the lock. She had nothing to defend herself with except a paring knife on the kitchen counter, and the survival instincts of someone who had lived long enough on the South Side to know that the silence after a knock could be more dangerous than the knock itself. She opened the door just wide enough to see outside. The man standing in the dark hallway looked as if the darkness itself had given birth to him. Tall, broad-shouldered, a long black coat falling almost to his knees. His face marked by old scars, running from his temple down to the left side of his jaw. His eyes held no threat, but they held nothing close to friendliness either. Only the cold patience of a man used to waiting outside closed doors. Meredith Ashford? His voice was low and even. Mara tightened her grip on the edge of the door, but didn't step back. "Who's asking?" "My name is Sully Voss. Mr. Kincaid sent me." The name Kincaid moved through the cold air like a stone dropped onto frozen water. Mara didn't know Barrett Kincaid, had never met him, had never heard anyone mention him directly, but she knew that last name the way everyone on the South Side knew it, the way people know storms before they arrive, not because they have seen them, but because they have felt their weight in the air. Sully held out a small black USB drive resting in his calloused palm. "He needs an answer before noon tomorrow." Mara looked at the USB drive, then back at Sully. "I don't know anyone named Kincaid." "You'll understand when you watch it." Sully offered no further explanation, but in the brief moment before he turned away, his eyes moved past her shoulder and into the apartment. Mara knew what he saw. Knox curled beneath 2 coats, the dead heater, the fluorescent light flickering as if it were trying to breathe its final breaths. Sully's expression didn't change, no pity, no judgment, but before he left, he set a small paper bag on the threshold with a care Mara hadn't expected from a man who looked as though he was used to handing over things far heavier than bread. Then he disappeared into the dark hallway without looking back. Mara locked the door and picked up the paper bag. Inside were bread, cheese, and 2 bottles of water. She set them on the kitchen table beside the hospital bill, then sat down in the only chair in the apartment that was still intact, and plugged the USB drive into the old laptop whose screen had a deadline running across the middle. The screen lit up. A man's face appeared in the darkness, only half of it illuminated by the soft yellow light of a desk lamp. Short, neatly cut black hair, a sharp jaw, dark brown eyes looking straight into the camera with such heavy focus that Mara felt as if he were looking through the screen to the exact place where she sat. Then he spoke, his voice rough, slow, every word carrying weight, as if each sentence had been measured before leaving his mouth. "My name is Barrett Kincaid. I'm sending this message because I no longer have enough time for polite meetings." He coughed, deep and long enough for Mara to see his shoulders fold inward with pain, then continued as if the cough had not existed. He said he had stage 3 lung cancer, said he needed a legal wife, not for love, but because he was dying, and needed an heir outside the Kincaid bloodline to stop his sister, Paige, from destroying everything he had built, including the free clinic for poor neighborhoods, the rent fund for families without insurance, and the scholarship program he had maintained for 10 years. In return, every medical cost for Knox would be paid. Her brother would be moved to the top of the kidney transplant waiting list, and after Barrett's death, Mara would inherit control of the organization's legal assets. In the final sentence of the video, Barrett looked straight into the camera and spoke more slowly than anything he had said before. "I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for courage." The screen went dark. The apartment sank back into darkness, and the sound of water leaking from the ceiling. Mara sat motionless for a very long time, staring at the black screen, staring at the small USB drive in her hand, then looking over at Knox, still asleep on the sofa, his breathing light and steady beneath the two coats. She pulled out the USB drive, walked to the kitchen table, and pressed it beneath the chipped mug beside the $47,000 bill, right where every impossible thing in her life waited. Mara couldn't sleep that night. She lay on the kitchen floor beside the chair where Knox was sleeping, her eyes open, staring up at the ceiling where the damp stains spread like the map of a country no one would ever want to live in. And in her mind, that small black USB drive kept turning over and over like an unexploded bullet. She had tried everything. 3 medical charities had rejected Knox's file because he wasn't in their priority group. The bank had denied her a loan because she had no collateral except a laptop with a cracked screen and a closet of clothes barely enough for 2 seasons. And she had once spent an entire night researching whether she could donate one of her own kidneys before the doctor told her she didn't qualify because prolonged malnutrition had already affected her own kidney function. Every door had closed, not slammed shut, but closed slowly, gently, politely, the way people reject the poor without having to look them in the eye. The next morning, Mara woke Knox at 6 o'clock so they could make it to his dialysis appointment. He sat up slowly, his eyes dull from lack of sleep, his skin still carrying that pale gray color Mara had grown so used to seeing that she had forgotten normal human skin wasn't supposed to look like that. On the way to the hospital, the siblings walked 4 blocks in the cold wind because Mara didn't have enough money to call a car, and Knox didn't complain once, even though his legs were heavier than usual with every step. He only pulled his hood lower and kept walking. Mara looked at her brother from behind and felt the scar on her back ache beneath her thin shirt, not from the cold, but from memory. 8 years earlier, she had lost both parents in a single night. She never told Knox the details of that night: the smell of smoke, the sound of glass breaking, the way the hospital lights were so white they hurt her eyes when she woke with her back wrapped in bandages. She only knew that when she opened her eyes, her little brother was lying in the bed beside hers, alive, and that was enough. It had always been enough. In the hospital waiting room, Knox curled up on a hard plastic chair, reading a book with a broken spine that he had read at least 3 times, while Mara sat beside him pretending to look at her phone when she was really counting every minute, until the doctor called his name. When the doctor came out, he didn't call Knox. He called Mara into the hallway, where the white lights fell over his face as if exposing every wrinkle of professional exhaustion. He spoke briefly. Knox needed a kidney transplant within 6 months. Otherwise, his kidney function would collapse completely, and there would be no treatment option left to replace it. The cost of the transplant, the anti-rejection medication, the recovery after surgery, and long-term follow-up care was far beyond anything Mara could earn in an entire lifetime working at a laundromat, in an entire lifetime doing any work that a person with no degree, no property, and no one standing behind her could possibly do. Mara stood in the hospital hallway and listened without saying a word. She returned to the waiting room. Knox looked up from his book, looked at her, and gave her a weak smile, the kind of smile worn by a child who had grown used to watching his sister walk out of conversations with doctors paler than when she had walked in. Mara smiled back. Then she stepped into the hallway again, walked to the far end where no one could see her, took out her phone, and called the only number written on the label of the USB drive. Sully answered after 2 rings. No greeting, only silence, waiting. "I agree," Mara said. Her voice didn't tremble. Her hand did. The black SUV picked Mara up in front of the hospital gate the following afternoon, and from the moment she stepped into the car, the world beyond the window began to change block by block, as if she were moving through the layers of a dream, each layer cleaner, whiter, and quieter than the one before it. Snow on the south side was dirty snow, gray, mixed with mud and exhaust smoke. But the farther north they drove, the whiter the snow became, lying across wide lawns as if no foot had ever stepped on it, and the streets no longer carried the sound of honking cars or curses thrown from windows, only the thick silence of money. Sully drove without saying a word for 40 minutes, and Mara didn't ask anything either. She only sat there watching two worlds slide past each other outside the glass, and wondered which one she belonged to, or whether she belonged to neither. The Kincaid mansion appeared after a long curve lined with leafless oak trees, its Tudor-style red brick rising against the gray sky like something that had stood here before the city existed, and would still be standing after everything else collapsed. The iron gate opened automatically without making a sound, and when Mara stepped out of the car, the first thing she noticed wasn't the grandeur, but the silence. This house swallowed every sound, as if it had forgotten how to echo a long time ago. Sully led her through the front door into a long hallway floored in dark wood, past portraits on the walls where no one was smiling, past pale yellow lamps giving off just enough light to see the way but not enough to feel warm. Mara's footsteps rang against the wooden floor, and suddenly she became painfully aware of her old sneakers, her faded coat, every single thing on her body screaming that she didn't belong here. At the end of the hallway, Sully stopped in front of a heavy double door made of wood. For the first time since she had met him, Mara saw Sully hesitate, only for a moment, so brief it almost didn't exist, his hand pausing on the handle as if weighing one last time whether to let her step inside. Then he opened the door. The room inside was darker than the hallway, lit only by a desk lamp that cast light over half the face of the man seated behind a large walnut desk. Barrett Kincaid looked completely different from the image in the video. In the video, darkness had hidden most of him. But here, under the yellow light, Mara could see every detail clearly. His short, neatly cut black hair had begun to silver at the temples. His jaw was sharp as if carved by a knife. His dark brown eyes were set deeper than they should have been for a man she guessed was 33, and the gray three-piece suit on his body sat loose at the collar, as if it had been made for a healthier version of him, a version that had existed before illness began eating him from the inside. There were no cigars, no gold, no guards standing behind him. Nothing Mara had ever imagined when she thought of the Kincaid name. There was only a man sitting alone in a room too large for him, and an exhaustion so visible it almost had physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. Then he coughed. The cough came suddenly, deep, long, tearing through the stillness of the room as if someone were ripping fabric inside his chest. Barrett gripped the edge of the desk with one hand, lifted a handkerchief to his mouth with the other, and when the coughing stopped, Mara saw him fold the handkerchief quickly and slip it into the inner pocket of his vest. But she had seen it. The blood on the white cloth, small but clear, and the nurse's instinct inside her diagnosed it immediately before thought could interfere. Lungs. Late stage. Tissue hemorrhage. He was dying faster than the video had revealed. Barrett straightened as if the coughing fit had never happened and looked directly at her. Miss Ashford. His voice was rougher than in the video, but it carried the same weight, each word placed down carefully like stone being laid into a wall. Sit down. Mara sat in the chair across from the desk, her back straight, her hands resting on her lap, and waited. Barrett didn't circle around the subject. He spoke about Paige, his sister, the woman who would sell every brick of this house before the dirt on his grave had time to dry, the woman who would close the free clinic on the south side, fire every employee, and turn 10 years of his building into cash before pouring it all onto the tables in Vegas within one summer. He spoke about the clinic, the rent fund, the scholarship program, and when he spoke of those things, his eyes softened in a way Mara hadn't expected from a man with the Kincaid name. Then he looked at her and said the thing she wasn't prepared to hear. I know you, Miss Ashford. Not from yesterday. Mara blinked. Barrett gave a slight nod toward Sully, who stood silent by the door. Sully has been watching the free clinic on the south side for me for years. You volunteered there, 3 shifts a week, for 6 months, before Knox got sicker and you had to stop. You changed bandages for homeless patients with your bare hands because the clinic had run out of gloves. You stayed 2 hours later than everyone else, every shift, and you never told anyone about the scar on your back, even though it hurt every time you bent over for too long. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't known she had been watched. She hadn't known someone had counted the hours she stayed behind, had seen how she worked, had seen her wince when the scar ached while she thought no one noticed. Barrett leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, and his voice dropped lower but grew heavier. I didn't choose you because you're weak, Miss Ashford. I didn't choose you because you're poor or because you're desperate. I chose you because you're the strongest person I've ever seen, and you don't even know it." The room went completely silent. Mara didn't answer. She only looked down at her hands resting on her lap, the hands that had changed bandages, washed clothes, carried her brother, gripped her own wrists in the dark every night, and wondered whether the strength this man saw truly existed, or whether it was only the shadow desperation cast when there were no choices left. The wedding took place 3 days later in the very study where Mara had first seen Barrett cough up blood, and that coincidence did not leave her mind as she stood on the old Persian rug before the walnut desk, now cleared of papers to make room for a legal register and 2 pens. The judge was a silver-haired man Barrett had clearly known for a long time. He arrived without asking a single question except, "Where is the bride?" and looked at Mara with eyes so neutral she could not tell whether he pitied her, respected her, or was simply used to witnessing loveless marriages inside this house. Sully stood by the door as the witness, silent as a statue, his hands folded behind his back. There were no flowers, no music, no rings, because Barrett said he would let her choose one later if she wanted. And the way he said it, calm, without pressure, made Mara understand that he truly did not expect this to become anything beyond paperwork. Mara wore the only white shirt she still had intact, and the black pants she usually wore to job interviews, and she realized, with quiet bitterness, that she was wearing interview clothes to her own wedding. Barrett wore a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, looking almost normal if one did not notice the way he stood slightly tilted to the left, as if the right side of his chest hurt and he did not want anyone to know. Then Mara saw the open laptop on the desk, and her heart stopped. Knox was looking at her from the screen. Lying in the private hospital bed Barrett had transferred him to the day before, wearing a pale blue hospital gown, his hair messy, but smiling. A weak, slightly tilted smile. The kind of smile Knox wore when he wanted to seem all right even when nothing was all right. And he lifted his hand to wave softly through the camera and said, "You look pretty," in a hoarse voice that made Mara bite down hard on her lip so she would not cry right there. She had not known Barrett had arranged this. She had not known he had contacted the hospital, requested the video connection, made sure Knox could see his sister on this day. And she did not know where to place that gesture in the picture she was trying to build of Barrett Kincaid, because cold men did not think about letting a 17-year-old boy see his sister on her wedding day. The judge read the vows briefly, his voice as even as if he were reading a rental agreement. When he asked Barrett, the answer came at once, calm, unwavering. "I do." When he asked Mara, 3 seconds passed. 3 seconds the whole room felt. Sully standing more still than usual, the judge lifting his eyes from the register, and Barrett looking at her not with pressure, but with the patient waiting of a man used to standing at the edge of a cliff and waiting for the answer that would decide everything. "I do," Mara said, and her voice was so small she was not sure the judge had heard it until he nodded and wrote in the register. There was no kiss. Barrett only gave her a slight nod, a small gesture Mara did not know whether to understand as thanks, acknowledgement, or a promise. Then a coughing fit pulled him away, and the ceremony ended with papers being signed, and the judge's footsteps leaving the room. On the laptop screen, Knox had fallen asleep halfway through, his head tilted to one side, and Mara watched her brother sleep through the screen for several seconds before Sully gently closed the laptop. That evening, Sully took Mara to her private room on the 3rd floor. The room was larger than the entire basement apartment she had once lived in, with thick curtains, a warm fire burning in the fireplace, a large bed made with white sheets, and the dense silence of a place that had never belonged to her. Mara sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, looking around, and felt as if she had just stepped into the most beautiful cage she had ever seen. At midnight, she opened the bedroom door to get water and almost stepped on something placed right outside the threshold. A small box, unwrapped, with no note. Inside was a tube of burn scar cream, the specialized medical kind Mara had once researched online through many sleepless nights, reading the price again and again before turning off her phone, because it cost more than 3 weeks of her wages. No one in this house saw her step out. The hallway was dark and completely silent. Mara stood there for a long time, the box of cream in her hand, and felt her throat close in a way she was not used to. Not from pain, not from fear, but because a dying man had taken the time to find out what kind of cream the scar on her back needed to hurt less. In the first days inside the Kincaid mansion, Mara lived like a polite ghost who didn't know which room she was supposed to haunt. She wasn't a servant, but no one called her the mistress of the house. She wasn't a guest, but no corner of the mansion carried any trace of her, and she moved through the long hallways with the lightest steps she could manage, as if afraid that if she made too much noise, the house would realize she didn't belong there and throw her out. Old habits were the only things keeping her from falling into the emptiness. Every morning, she woke at 5 o'clock before any of the staff appeared, washed the dishes from the night before even though the cook had already washed them, refolded the blanket on the bed even though someone came to clean the room every day, and wiped the kitchen counter with a damp cloth out of habit from the laundromat, because her hands needed to do something familiar, so her mind wouldn't have to think about the fact that she had just married a dying man she knew less about than the coffee vendor at the corner of the South Side Street. The household staff looked at her in confusion, but no one said anything. They only quietly washed again the dishes she had already washed and folded again, the blankets she had already folded, and Mara knew it, but she kept doing it anyway, because stopping meant facing the question she had no answer for. What was she doing here? On the morning of the 5th day, Mara was standing in the kitchen making coffee at 6 o'clock, when the sound of footsteps made her turn. Barrett stood in the kitchen doorway, and she almost didn't recognize him. No three-piece suit, no walnut desk, no desk lamp casting light over half his face and giving him the cold, controlled look she had seen in the study. Only a man in a wrinkled white shirt, his hair slightly messy from sleep, and shadows under his eyes heavier than any Mara had ever seen on her own face in the morning. He looked smaller without the suit, almost ordinary, almost vulnerable, and that unsettled Mara more than all his coldness before, because she knew how to deal with powerful people, but she didn't know how to deal with someone weak who was trying to hide it. Barrett looked at the cup of coffee on the counter, then at her. "You don't need to do this. Coffee doesn't need a reason," Mara answered without looking up, her hand still wiping the counter even though the counter was already clean. Silence spread between them, but not the heavy kind of silence she had felt in the study the day before. This silence was lighter, thinner, like the first ice of the season that could crack beneath a foot placed wrong. Barrett sat down on the kitchen chair beside the counter, and it was the first time he had sat in the same room with her without a work desk, files, or Sully standing between them. Just two people and a steaming cup of coffee in the early winter morning. Then the cough came. It came without warning, deep and long enough that Barrett had to grip the edge of the counter with one hand while the other clenched into a fist on his thigh. The coffee cup trembled lightly on the stone counter, and Mara saw his hand shake, not from cold, but because his body was fighting something far larger than willpower. She didn't think. Her nurse's instinct moved faster than reason. She stepped beside him and placed her hand on his back. Her warm palm spread across the thin fabric of his shirt, and beneath her hand she felt every spasm of his diaphragm, every broken breath, every effort his body was making just to complete one simple action that ordinary people never had to think about. The cough faded slowly. Barrett breathed, slow, even, controlled, in the way of a man who had practiced breathing through pain so many times it had become reflex. And in the quiet moment after the coughing fit, they both realized that Mara's hand was still on his back. She pulled it away as quickly as if she had touched a hot stove and stepped back, her eyes dropping to the floor. Barrett didn't look at her. He looked at the cup of coffee in front of him, reached for it, and took a slow sip. Then he spoke, his voice still rough from the cough, but carrying something softer than anything Mara had heard from him before. "Good coffee." 2 words. No thank you for making it. No acknowledgement of the hand on his back. Nothing grand or life-changing. Only 2 small words placed gently into the winter morning, like someone setting a pebble on the riverbank, without knowing it would change the direction of the current. But enough. For Mara, on that morning, those 2 words were enough. The private hospital room where Knox had been moved looked as if it belonged to another world, compared with the plastic emergency room chair he had been used to curling up on for the past 2 years. The walls were painted clean white. The window curtains softened the light. The hospital bed had electric controls. And there was a television mounted on the wall that Knox had not turned on even once, because he was still halfway through the broken spine book he had brought from the basement apartment. The kidney specialist came to see him twice a day, instead of once a week, the way it had been at the public hospital. The nurses called Knox by his name, instead of by his bed number, and on the bedside cabinet there was a small vase of flowers someone had placed there, even though no one in that room knew whether Knox liked flowers or not. Mara sat beside her brother's bed on the afternoon of the 3rd day after the wedding, and for the first time in a long while, she saw color in Knox's face, Not healthy pink, but at least no longer the ash gray she had grown so used to that she had forgotten it wasn't normal. Knox was sitting with his back against the pillows, the book turned face down on his chest, looking at his sister with the gaze Mara had always been afraid to face, a gaze older than his years, the gaze of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly because illness had not allowed him the luxury of innocence. "Sis," Knox said, his voice calm in the deliberate way Mara recognized at once, because she used that same voice whenever she tried to hide the storm inside her. "Who did you marry?" Mara had prepared for that question from the moment she stepped into the hospital room. She had prepared a neat, reasonable answer, something enough for a 17-year-old boy to accept without needing to ask more. But when Knox looked at her with those eyes, every answer she had prepared melted like snow touching a warm road. "Someone who can help us," she said softly. Knox did not blink. "Do you love him?" Silence stretched between the two siblings, longer than any silence Mara had ever shared with Barrett in the study or in the kitchen at 6 o'clock in the morning. Because silence with a stranger was easy, but silence with the person she loved most in the world, when she knew the honest answer would hurt him, was harder than anything she had ever faced. Knox looked at his sister for a few more seconds, then nodded slowly, as if Mara's silence had said more than any sentence she could have spoken. "You traded your life for me, didn't you?" The question carried no accusation, no anger. It carried the voice of someone who had known the answer before asking, and only needed her silence to confirm it. Mara opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked down at her hand holding Knox's, her calloused fingers wrapped around his thin, cold ones. And she thought this was why she had agreed. Not the USB drive, not Barrett's rough voice in the darkness, not the $47,000 bill, but this hand, the small hand she had held since the night they lost their parents and had never let go. Knox stayed silent for a long while, looking out the window where snow was falling lightly over the hospital parking lot, then turned back to his sister. "Then at least don't let anyone treat you badly." He said it calmly, but his eyes were so serious that Mara understood this wasn't advice from a younger brother. It was a condition, the only condition Knox placed on accepting everything happening around him that he had no power to control. Mara nodded. "All right." She said it like a promise, even though she did not know whether she could keep it. She stayed with Knox for another hour, talking about the book he was reading, about how awful the hospital food was, about the small, ordinary things the two siblings used to fill the spaces between the things too large to put into words. And for that entire hour, Mara smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since she had stepped into the Kincaid mansion. She did not know that outside the hospital hallway, about 10 steps from Knox's room, Barrett Kincaid was standing and watching through the glass panel. No one knew when he had arrived. He stood still against the hallway wall with his long coat not yet taken off, looking into the hospital room where Mara was holding Knox's hand and smiling. He watched that smile for a long time, the first smile he had witnessed on her face since the day they met, then turned away before anyone realized he was there. On the drive back, Sully drove in silence as always until they stopped at a red light at the Lincoln Park intersection. "Do you want to go in?" Sully asked without looking into the rearview mirror. "No," Barrett answered. Then there was silence all the way home. Dinner took place on the Saturday evening of the second week, in the grand dining room Mara had never stepped into since the day she arrived at the mansion. The long oak table, large enough to seat 12 people, had been set with white porcelain plates, crystal glasses, and tall white candles arranged in a line over the dark tablecloth, and everything looked so beautiful that Mara felt as if she were walking into a magazine photograph without holding an invitation in her hand. Barrett had told her that morning that the dinner was mandatory, that the senior members of the organization needed to meet his wife, and the way he said the word mandatory made Mara understand this wasn't a family meal, but a stage, and she was the lead actress who had never been allowed to read the script. The guests arrived at 7 o'clock. 4 men in black suits whose names Mara didn't know and didn't want to know, a cold-faced lawyer she had seen at the wedding, and Paige Kincaid. Paige entered the dining room last, slower than everyone else, as if she wanted to make sure everyone saw her before she saw them. 40 years old, blonde hair cut to her shoulders, blue eyes sharp as broken glass, and the smile of someone who had learned very young how to use grace as a weapon. She wore an expensive black dress, a thin gold necklace, and when she stepped toward Mara, her eyes moved from the shoes Mara had borrowed from one of the maids, up to the shirt Mara had meticulously ironed before dinner. "My new sister-in-law," Paige said, her voice sweet in the way sugar can be sweet when sprinkled over the edge of a blade. Interesting. She shook Mara's hand with cold, dry fingers and held it longer than necessary, as if measuring the other woman's strength through the pressure of her grip. Dinner began in polite silence. The appetizer plates were brought out, wine was poured, and small conversations passed among the members about real estate, about a new transport project, about numbers Mara didn't understand, but she sat with her back straight and listened, because that was the only thing she could do. Barrett sat at the head of the table, eating little, speaking little, but his eyes kept moving from face to face, as if he were reading a book in which each person was a chapter. Then Paige began. She turned to Mara with a friendly smile that someone across the table might have mistaken for interest if they hadn't looked into her eyes. "So, what did you do before you met Barrett?" Mara set her fork down. "I used to be a nurse." "Used to?" Paige tilted her head, her voice carrying a carefully measured curiosity. "Did something happen?" "I changed jobs," Mara answered shortly, her voice calm even though beneath the table her hand was gripping her left wrist until it turned white. Paige nodded slowly, took a sip of wine, then continued as if Mara's answer had only been the opening to the real interrogation. "And where did you meet Barrett?" "I ask because, my family is very private, and when Barrett announced he was married without inviting his own sister, I was a little surprised." She laughed softly, and that laugh floated across the dinner table like a thin blade that only Mara could feel cutting her. Mara opened her mouth to answer, but Paige had already continued, her voice still sweet, though her eyes had hardened. "I hope you aren't just a decorative flower in this house." The dining room didn't exactly fall silent because the other conversations were still going, but the air around the table thickened as if someone had dropped the temperature by 10 degrees. Barrett set his knife down on the table, not hard, not angrily, just the gentle, precise, deliberate sound of metal touching wood, and that sound cut through every other noise in the room more effectively than any shout could have. Everyone went quiet. Paige looked up. Barrett didn't look at Paige. He looked down at his plate, his voice low and even enough that the person at the far end of the table had to lean forward to hear. "Meredith is my wife. Everyone at this table should remember that." No one said anything for 3 seconds. Paige smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It stopped at her lips, as if her eyes were saying something entirely different from her mouth. Then she lifted her wineglass and said, "Of course, little brother," in a light voice that sounded to Mara like the closing of a coffin lid. Dinner continued after that, but no one asked Mara another question. After the guests had gone, Mara walked down the dark hallway toward her room and heard Barrett's footsteps behind her, slower than hers, heavier with the exhaustion he had hidden all evening. She stopped and turned. "You didn't need to protect me." Barrett stopped a few steps away, his face half in light and half in shadow beneath the hallway lamp. "I know you don't need it," he said, "but you deserve to be protected." Then he walked past her, his footsteps dragging down the hallway until the sound disappeared around the turn, and Mara stood alone in the darkness, for the first time unsure whether she should fear Paige Kincaid or fear the sudden warmth spreading through her chest after the words of a man she still didn't understand. 2 days after the dinner with Paige, Mara found Barrett in the study and said she wanted to go to the free clinic on the south side. Barrett looked up from the stack of files, watched her for a few seconds without saying anything, then nodded and called Sully. He didn't ask why, and Mara didn't explain, but both of them understood that she needed to see with her own eyes the thing he had described in words in the study on the first day, because Mara had heard too many words from a crime boss since the night the USB drive appeared at her door, but proof was something she hadn't seen. Sully drove her back to the south side on a gray afternoon, through the same streets she had walked every day for 2 years while working at the laundromat, past the same corner where she and Knox had once walked to the public hospital in the cold wind, and Mara watched the old neighborhood slide past the car window with the strange feeling of someone who had left a place for less than 3 weeks and already saw it as distant as another lifetime. The clinic was in the basement of an old church on Ashland Avenue, the kind of gray brick church people passed every day without ever looking up, because it blended into the crumbling wall around it as if it were trying to hide on purpose. There was no sign outside, only a small iron door leading down a narrow stairway, and without knowing ahead of time, no one would have guessed that beneath the ground there was a clinic still operating. Mara stepped down the stairs, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with the damp mold of an old basement reached her before her eyes could adjust to the weak light inside. The clinic was smaller than she had imagined. with only 2 examination rooms divided by cloth curtains, a waiting area lined with plastic chairs against the wall, and a pressed wood reception desk whose paint had almost completely peeled away, but it was full of people. A line of patients stretched from the reception desk all the way to the foot of the stairs. Homeless men in torn coats, a single mother holding a small child while waiting in a chair, an old man coughing into a handkerchief and sitting silently in the corner. 2 volunteer nurses moved quickly between the examination rooms, with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this so often that their bodies knew the path by themselves. Mara stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched without stepping farther in, and her eyes stopped on the reception desk. On the desktop, beside a box of rubber gloves and a bottle of rubbing alcohol, there was a large hardcover ledger lying open on the current page. She stepped closer and looked down. Hundreds of handwritten names were arranged in columns across pages, yellowed by time, the ink changing color from one period to another. Some names written in blue ballpoint pen faded almost to nothing, some names written in pencil with the trembling script of old hands, and some pages with dates in the corner from 7 years ago, 8 years ago, even nearly 10 years ago. This clinic wasn't something built in a few weeks to impress her. It had existed long before Barrett knew her name, before Sully knocked on the basement apartment door, before the USB drive appeared in the night. It had existed quietly underground, like everything Barrett did, unseen, unthanked, simply existing because someone had decided that people on the South Side deserved medical care too, even when they had no money. Mara turned a few more pages. She recognized some of the names. Mrs. Rodriguez from the 3rd-floor apartment on Halsted Street, whom Mara used to see limping every morning. Mr. Mitchell, who sold newspapers at the corner of 47th Street, and whom everyone had thought was dead since last winter. And she remembered that 6 months before Knox's illness grew worse, she herself had stood in this room, wearing gloves and changing bandages for strangers every Tuesday and Thursday evening, not knowing someone was watching her from the other side of this ledger. Sully waited at the foot of the stairs without saying a word. On the way back to the mansion, Mara sat in the car and watched the city pass beyond the window without speaking. But something inside her had shifted, gently, almost too slightly to notice, like the first thin crack forming in ice beneath the weight of spring, invisible to the eye. That evening, Barrett was sitting alone in the living room, reading files beneath the yellow lamp, when Mara walked in. She didn't explain why, didn't ask permission. She simply sat down in the armchair across from him, took a financial ledger from the bookshelf, the one Barrett had said she should start learning, and opened it to read in silence. Barrett looked up at her for 1 second. Then he returned to his files. No one said anything. But for the first time since arriving at the Kincaid mansion, Mara sat in a room without feeling like she was extra. The snowstorm came on the 3rd night of the 4th week, arriving without warning in the way Chicago always did. 1 hour it was only ordinary cold wind, and the next it was a white wall sweeping across the city like a giant hand wiping everything away. The power grid went down at 10 o'clock at night. The Kincaid mansion sank into total darkness within seconds, and the wind howling beyond the windows sounded like the breath of some enormous animal trying to push the walls down. The staff had gone home that afternoon because of the weather forecast. Sully was in his private apartment on the eastern side of the property, and inside the vast dark mansion, there were only 2 people and 1 fire burning in the living room fireplace. Mara came down the stairs in the dark with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and found Barrett already sitting in front of the fireplace, his back against the armchair, the flames dancing over half his face. He looked more tired than usual, a tiredness that didn't come only from illness, but from something deeper, something darkness and solitude pulled out of the places he kept hidden by daylight, beneath his suit and controlled voice. She sat down in the chair across from him, about an arm's length away, the closest they had ever sat to each other without a desk or dining table or anything else standing between them. The fire crackled, the wind roared outside, and in the small space between the 2 armchairs, the silence began to change shape. Barrett stared into the fire for a long time before speaking, and when he did, his voice was lower than usual. Not the voice of the Kincaid boss setting a knife down on a dining table and silencing an entire room, but the voice of someone speaking from a very far place inside himself, a place he rarely opened for anyone to enter. My mother was a seamstress. Mira didn't move, didn't look over. She only listened, because instinctively she understood that if she turned to look at him now, he would stop. She made clothes for people in the neighborhood, cheap clothes, mending old shirts, altering dresses so they would fit. She worked 14 hours a day on a sewing machine she kept in the kitchen. He stopped. The fire snapped softly. She died when I was 17. Mara waited. Barrett didn't give more details, and she didn't ask, because the way he said the word died carried the weight of 1,000 hidden words he had chosen not to say, and that choice alone told enough of the story. After that day, he continued, his voice steadier now, as if he had passed through the hardest part, and what remained was only the bare truth. I swore no one in that neighborhood would die because they were poor again. No one would die because they couldn't pay for medicine, couldn't pay for heat, didn't have anyone standing between them and the thing killing them. He looked into the fire. The clinic, the rent fund, the scholarships, all of it runs on dirty money. A pause. Ironic, isn't it? Mara heard every word and felt them settle inside her like stones dropping to the bottom of a well. Slow, heavy. And when they reached the bottom, the ripples spread outward and wouldn't stop. She thought of the yellowed ledger in the basement clinic, of the hundreds of handwritten names, of nearly 10 years of someone quietly keeping that place alive without ever putting his name on the wall. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence waiting for someone to fill it with something equal in weight. Then, without thinking, without planning, Mara lifted her hand to the collar of her shirt and pulled it gently aside. The fabric slipped from her left shoulder, revealing the upper edge of the burn scar that ran from her shoulder down her back, the skin wrinkled and discolored beneath the firelight like a topographical map of the pain she had carried for 8 years and had never willingly let anyone see. Barrett turned toward her. His eyes stopped on the scar, and Mara waited for the thing she had always feared whenever she imagined letting someone see it, pity or disgust, or the quick turning away of someone who did not want to look at something ugly. But Barrett did none of those things. He looked at the scar with quiet eyes, with the silent recognition of someone who had carried his own wounds, long enough to know that looking directly at another person's wound, without turning away, was the deepest form of respect 2 damaged people could give each other. I understand what it means to carry something you didn't choose, Mara said softly, and pulled her shirt back into place. Barrett was silent for a moment. Then he said, his voice carrying something she had never heard from him before, almost gentle. You're stronger than anyone I know. Mara shook her head slightly. I'm not strong. I just didn't have another choice. Barrett looked at her through the firelight, and for the first time, a smile appeared on his face. Not wide, not warm, only the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, almost not there at all, but it changed his whole face. That's exactly what strength is. The wind roared outside, the fire burned inside, and the arm's length of space between the 2 chairs suddenly no longer felt like distance, but like an unspoken promise, that perhaps one day the distance would grow smaller, not now, not tonight, but someday, when both of them were ready for the very thing they both feared. After the night of the snowstorm, something changed between them that neither one named, and at the same time, the illness began demanding its price from Barrett faster. His voice grew weak in the middle of sentences. There were afternoons when he was explaining the organization's financial structure to Mara and suddenly stopped, not because he had run out of meaning, but because his breath wasn't strong enough to carry the next word out of his mouth, and he would sit still for a few seconds, eyes lowered to the tabletop, waiting for his lungs to yield, before continuing as if that pause had never existed. The number of hours he slept each day slowly increased. At first, Mara noticed because he came down to the study half an hour later, then 1 hour later, and then there were mornings when he didn't come down until nearly noon, and when he did, the shadows under his eyes were so heavy they looked like bruises. Mara said nothing about those changes. She only began leaving his medicine bottle on his desk every morning before he woke, setting it beside the cup of coffee she had made and never mentioned. She began cooking morning porridge instead of letting the cook do it because she knew Barrett was eating less each day, and she wanted to make sure whatever he did eat was warm enough and soft enough for a body that was failing. Every night before bed, she passed his room and checked the temperature on the heating panel outside his door, raising it by 2 degrees if the night was too cold, because she knew his body had lost the ability to hold warmth like a normal person's. She did all of it in silence, and Barrett never mentioned any of it. He didn't thank her for the medicine on the desk, didn't comment on the morning porridge, didn't say he knew who had adjusted the temperature in his room each night. But he began leaving the study at 8 o'clock in the evening, exactly when Mara usually sat in the living room reading the financial ledgers, and he would sit in the armchair across from her, the chair that now carried the shape of his body because he sat there every night and read his files while Mara read the books. And sometimes she asked him a question about a number and he answered. And sometimes neither of them said anything at all, and the silence between them had become the kind of silence only two people familiar with each other could have. The kind that didn't need to be filled because it was already enough. One evening, near the end of the second month, Mara fell asleep on the sofa. She didn't remember when she drifted off, only that the financial file was still resting on her chest as consciousness slipped away, and the firelight from the fireplace moved softly across the living room ceiling was the last thing she saw before her eyes closed. Barrett entered the living room close to 10 o'clock and stopped at the threshold. Mara lay curled on the sofa, her head tilted to one side, dark brown hair spilling across the pillow, the file sliding slightly on her chest with the even rhythm of her breathing. He stood there for a very long time, longer than he had ever spent looking at anyone without saying a word, and the firelight on his face carried an expression no one in the Kincaid organization had ever seen and would never believe if someone told them. He walked to the sofa, took the cashmere blanket, folded over the back of the armchair, and gently spread it over her, carefully pulling the edge across her shoulders so the warmth wouldn't escape. Then his hand stopped, less than 1 inch from her hair, and he held it there for a second that seemed to stretch longer than any other second in his life, his fingers almost touching the strand of hair fallen across her forehead but not touching, holding the thinnest possible distance between daring and not daring. Then he drew his hand back and left the room without making a sound. Mara didn't wake. She didn't know about the blanket, about the hand, about that moment. But Sully knew. He stood outside the living room door, where he always stood every night to make sure the house was secure before locking up, and he saw everything. He saw Barrett Kincaid, the man he had followed for 20 years through battlefields and boardrooms, through threats and negotiations, through nights when death stood closer than arm's length, saw that man standing with trembling hands before a sleeping woman. For the first time in 20 years, Sully saw his boss's hand tremble not from fear or anger, but from something Sully had no word for, and recognized the moment he saw it, because it looked exactly like the way people tremble when they stand before the thing they want most to keep in this world, and know they don't have enough time left. Barrett disappeared on a Tuesday morning and did not appear for 2 days. The medicine bottle Mara had left on his desk remained unopened, the coffee had gone cold, and the morning porridge was untouched. On the first day, Mara thought he needed to be alone, because she had learned that Barrett Kincaid carried pain the way he wore a suit, privately, discreetly, never letting anyone help him take it off. But by the evening of the second day, when the study was still dark and the armchair across from her in the living room was still empty, unease began to gnaw at her from the inside out. She asked Sully. He shook his head. He said no one is to disturb him. Mara looked at Sully and realized that it was not an order he agreed with, but an order he obeyed out of 20 years of habit, and his scarred eyes were telling her what his mouth was not allowed to say, that someone should break that order right now. Mara began to search. Barrett's bedroom was empty. The study was empty. The living room was empty. The library was empty. She moved through every hallway in the mansion like someone searching for a person inside a maze where every turn looked the same, and the silence was so thick she could hear her own heartbeat. Then she saw the basement door standing slightly open. She had never been down to the basement. No one mentioned it. No one had guided her there when introducing the house, as if the basement were the room the mansion hid away in the same way Barrett hid the blood-stained handkerchief inside the pocket of his vest. The narrow stairs led down to a short hallway paved with old tile, and at the end of the hallway was a wooden door thinner than every other door in this house. Mara pushed it open. The room was small, smaller than any room she had seen in the mansion, and it looked as if time had stopped there a very long time ago, and no one had bothered to press the button to make it move again. An old sewing machine sat in the corner on a small wooden table, the kind of treadle sewing machine Mara had only ever seen in old photographs. Its needle rusted, white thread still drawn through the eye as if the last person using it had stood up midway and never returned. On the shelf above it, scraps of fabric were stacked neatly, their colors faded but still kept in order, and the smell of old cloth mixed with dust and time filled the room like the breath of someone who had been absent for a very long time but had never truly left. Barrett sat on the cold tile floor, his back against the wall beneath the fabric shelf, both legs stretched out in front of him, his head tilted slightly to one side. He looked small in this room in a way he never looked small anywhere else. as if this room were the only place in the world where he allowed himself not to be Barrett Kincaid. Mara saw the handkerchief in his hand, clenched tight, stained with blood, and this time he did not hide it, did not fold it away, did not slip it into his pocket, only held it like a man holding the one thing still real in his hand, while everything else was drifting away. She knelt beside him on the cold tile floor. "Get up," she said. Barrett did not open his eyes. "Give me one more minute." "No." Mara's voice came out harder than she had intended, but she did not take it back. "Get up. I didn't come here to watch you give up." Barrett opened his eyes slowly and looked at her, and in the weak light from the single ceiling bulb, his eyes held something Mara had never seen there before. Not cold control, not familiar exhaustion, but fear, real fear that the Kincaid boss had never shown in front of anyone. "I'm not afraid of dying, Mara." He said it, and for the first time he called her by the shorter name without needing a reason, without needing a turning point, only because in that moment, sitting on the floor of the room where his mother had once sewn, he no longer had the strength to keep distance between them. "I'm afraid of you facing Paige and this whole organization without anyone standing behind you." Mara tightened her hand around his, squeezing the blood-stained handkerchief and his cold fingers together inside the warmth of her palm, and when she spoke, her voice was cold enough to cut the air, yet unsteady enough to betray every piece of coldness she was trying to build. "Then don't die." Barrett looked at her, and he realized her voice was not cold because she was angry. It was cold because she was afraid of losing him, and that realization hurt more than any pain in his chest, because it meant someone in this world would truly hurt when he was gone. She helped him stand. Her shoulder took the weight of his body leaning against it, and they climbed the stairs slowly, one step at a time, Mara holding his arm tightly around her shoulders, while Barrett tried not to put all of his weight on her, even though his body wanted to collapse after every step. When they reached the ground floor hallway, the pale yellow light fell over them, and they looked like two ghosts helping each other through a house too large for them both. Mara brought him back to his room. She sat beside his bed all night, her hand still holding his, and neither of them said anything for many hours. Then, when the first light of morning began to leak through the curtains, Barrett whispered without opening his eyes, "If there had been time, I would have courted you properly, Meredith." Mara did not answer, but her hand did not let go of his, and that was a clearer answer than any words could have been. The mistake came from a bill. Barrett had hidden the cancer from the entire organization for months, with the kind of detailed control only a man used to living in darkness could maintain. Chemotherapy medication delivered privately through his personal doctor, medical records locked inside the safe in his study, and every appointment scheduled outside working hours, when no one in the mansion was likely to notice. But illness did not only eat away at the lungs, it also ate away at sharpness, and one afternoon, when Barrett was more exhausted than usual after a wave of pain that had lasted through the night before, he threw the chemotherapy bill into the trash can in his study, instead of feeding it into the shredder as he always did. One small lapse, only a thin piece of paper in a pile of trash. But for Paige Kincaid, one piece of paper was enough. Mara did not know exactly when Paige entered Barrett's study, did not know why the woman had come to the mansion or who had let her pass through the hallway without warning anyone. But the result was clear. 2 days after the night in the sewing room, when Mara went to the hospital to visit Knox in the afternoon, she saw the bouquet on her brother's bedside cabinet before she even had time to sit down. Fresh flowers, expensive, wrapped in white tissue paper and tied with a pale blue ribbon, the kind of flowers people send when they want to appear concerned without truly needing to care. Knox was lying in bed reading, his skin much pinker than it had been in the first weeks, thanks to the new treatment plan. And when Mara asked where the flowers had come from, he shrugged with the natural indifference of a teenage boy who had no interest in flowers. "Someone sent them this morning. The card's on the cabinet." Mara picked up the card. Thick paper, italic print, and the handwritten line inside was so brief it was almost polite. "Wishing you a quick recovery. The Kincaid family." Mara read it twice, then 3 times, and she understood. Not through logic, but through the instinct of someone who had lived long enough among dangerous people to recognize when a wish for good health was actually a message. And this message said, "I know where your brother is. I know which room. I know how to reach him." Paige did not threaten Knox. She did not need to threaten him. She only needed to let Mara know that she knew, and that knowledge itself was the most precise blow a woman like Paige could deliver without getting her hands dirty. Mara looked at Knox. He had already gone back to reading, knowing nothing about what the bouquet meant, nothing about Paige, nothing about the war unfolding beyond the four walls of that hospital room, and Mara wanted to keep him inside that unknowing forever. She slipped the card into her coat pocket. Then she picked up the bouquet, stepped into the hallway, and threw it into the nearest trash can without hesitation. On the way back to the mansion, Mara sat in the car while Sully drove and said nothing, her hand clenched around the card in her pocket, and she realized she was not panicking. She should have been panicking, because a powerful woman had just sent a signal that she knew Mara's only weakness. But instead of fear, Mara felt something harder, colder, sharper, something she realized had been growing inside her since the night she knelt on the basement floor and told Barrett Kincaid, "Then don't die." She had something to protect now, not only Knox, but also the dying house, and the man inside it, and everything he had built with dirty money and good intentions, and she would not let Paige Kincaid take any of it. When they reached the mansion, Mara walked straight into Barrett's study without knocking. Barrett sat behind the desk, looking weaker than he had the morning before, but his eyes were still sharp when he looked up. Mara said nothing. She only placed the card on the desk between them and pushed it gently toward him. Barrett picked up the card, read it, and his jaw clenched so tightly that Mara saw the muscle stand out beneath his skin. He said nothing for several seconds, but his dark brown eyes changed completely, no longer carrying the exhaustion or sorrow or hidden tenderness Mara had begun to recognize through those evenings in the living room and mornings over coffee. What she saw now was the pure instinct of a man who had built an empire from ashes, a man who had survived everything the streets of Chicago had thrown in his face, and it was so cold that Mara understood why the entire city spoke the Kincaid name in a lowered voice. Barrett set the card down. "Don't worry," he said, his voice low and even. "Knox will never receive another bouquet." He did not explain what he would do, and Mara did not ask, because for the first time, she saw both sides of Barrett Kincaid fully in the same moment, the man who covered her with a blanket while she slept, and the man this entire city feared, and she realized those two sides did not exist in contradiction, but for the same reason, because he protected what he held by every means this world had forced him to use. Paige came on an afternoon when Barrett wasn't at the mansion, because he was at the private clinic for routine tests that were now happening more often, every 2 weeks instead of once a month. And Mara knew what that meant, even though no one said it out loud. She was sitting in her private room on the 3rd floor, reading financial files, when the knock came, light, polite, the kind of knock made by someone who knew exactly that the lady of the house wasn't expecting her and didn't care. Mara opened the door, and Paige Kincaid stood in front of her without needing an invitation, without needing anyone to guide her, without needing anyone's permission, as if this house still belonged to her despite every will and marriage document in the world. Paige wore a black wool coat, her blonde hair perfectly brushed, her smile placed on her lips like an accessory carefully chosen before leaving the house. She stepped into the room without waiting for Mara to invite her, and looked around with the eyes of someone taking inventory of property, stopping at the large bed, the thick curtains, the fireplace burning warmly, as if she were calculating the value of each thing Mara was being allowed to use. "Beautiful room," Paige said lightly. "Eleanor used to stay in this room." The name of Barrett's late wife was released into the air like a stone thrown onto the surface of a still lake, and Mara understood at once that Paige hadn't mentioned Eleanor out of nostalgia, but because she wanted to remind Mara that she wasn't the first woman to sleep in that bed, and might not be the last. Mara didn't answer. She closed the door, not because she wanted privacy, but because she didn't want any of the staff hearing the conversation she knew was about to happen. Paige sat on the edge of the bed without being invited, crossed her legs, placed both hands on her knees, and looked at Mara with cold blue eyes, the smile on her mouth never reached. "You know what you are to Barrett, don't you?" Paige's voice was still gentle, friendly enough that anyone listening without seeing her eyes might have thought this was a conversation between two close women. A name on paper, nothing more, nothing less. Barrett needed someone to stand as heir, and you appeared at the right time. I understand that. I don't blame you. She tilted her head, her voice lowering slightly. "But have you thought about what happens after he dies?" Silence. Paige continued as if that question had only been the introduction. "When Barrett is gone, and he'll be gone sooner than you think, you'll be here alone. In this house, with people whose names you don't know, whose histories you don't know, whose loyalty you don't understand. Do you think Sully will take orders from you?" Do you think the lawyers will stand on your side? She smiled. You're no one, Meredith. You're the laundromat girl Barrett picked up because he needed a signature. And when that signature no longer has value, you'll go right back where you started. Mara heard every word and felt them cut into her skin the way words only cut when they touch something the listener fears might be true. But she didn't grip her wrist. Her hand stayed still on her lap, and her jaw slowly tightened, tight enough that she felt her teeth press together. And that was the change Paige didn't recognize. Though if Barrett had been there, he would have seen it at once, that the woman sitting in front of Paige now was not the same woman who had gripped her wrist in fear beneath the dinner table on the first night. Paige took a white envelope from her coat pocket and placed it on the bed between them. Sign the divorce papers. I'll give you $200,000. Enough to pay Knox's medical bills and disappear from Chicago. You go back to your life. I go back to managing my family. No one gets hurt. The way Paige said Knox's name sent hot blood running along Mara's spine. Not because it was a direct threat, but because of the familiarity she used when mentioning her brother, as if Knox were a number in a spreadsheet she had studied carefully before coming here. Mara looked at the envelope on the bed, looked up at Paige, and stood. I made a promise to my husband. Paige blinked, and for the first time, the smile on her lips wavered slightly. Your husband? She repeated, her voice mixing surprise with contempt. Mara didn't sit back down. She stood with her back straight, the same back marked by the long burn scar beneath her clothes, and looked down at Paige sitting on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in this conversation, the position of power reversed without anyone needing to raise her voice. You should leave, Miss Kincaid. Paige looked at her for several more seconds, with eyes that were recalculating everything because the equation she had brought into the room had produced a result different from the one she had predicted. Then she stood, smoothed her coat, picked up the white envelope and slipped it back into her pocket, and walked to the door. Before leaving the room, Paige stopped at the threshold and spoke without turning around. You'll regret this, Meredith. Then she left. The sound of her high heels traveled down the hallway and disappeared, and Mara stood alone in the middle of the room, her jaw still clenched, and realized her hands weren't shaking. For the first time in the face of a threat, Mara Ashford's hands weren't shaking. 3 days after Paige left her room, with the white envelope in her coat pocket, Mara sat in the living room at 10 o'clock at night with the stack of financial files Barrett had given her access to in the 3rd week after the wedding. She was used to the numbers now, not used to them in the way an accountant or a lawyer would be, but in the way a former nurse was used to spending thousands of hours reading a patient's vital signs, where a number shifting by half a unit could mean the difference between life and death. Mara read financial data with those eyes that did not look at the larger picture first, but at the smallest and strangest detail. And that night, she found it. In the real estate files belonging to the community fund Barrett maintained, there was a pending transfer for the affordable housing complex on the south side, the building Barrett had kept for years so poor families could rent below market price, the building where some of the people listed in the yellowed patient ledger at the basement clinic were living. The transfer papers listed the seller as a company Mara did not recognize, but when she dug deeper into the company registration records, she found Paige Kincaid's name on the list of founding members. Mara set the file down and looked into the darkness beyond the window. Paige was selling Barrett's community property before he had even had time to die, selling it through a shell company under her own name. And if the transaction went through, dozens of families on the south side would lose their homes because the new buyer would certainly raise the rent to market level, a level none of them could afford. Mara did not go to Barrett's room. She knew he was sleeping, because lately he slept more than he was awake. And she knew that every time she brought him bad news, his body paid for it, with a sleepless night he no longer had the strength to afford. Instead, the next morning she called Barrett's lawyer, the silver-haired man who had officiated the wedding in the study, Mr. Whitfield, and scheduled a meeting that same day. Mara arrived at Mr. Whitfield's law office at 10 o'clock in the morning, with the files under her arm and the manner of someone who had no time to be politely indirect. She placed the documents on his desk, pointed to the pending transfer, pointed to the shell company's name, pointed to Paige's name on the founding member list, and said that Barrett's will had not taken effect because he was still alive, that Paige had no right to sign away any asset belonging to the community fund when Barrett was its sole controlling party, and that Mr. Whitfield needed to stop this transaction before it closed at the end of the week. Mara was not a lawyer. She did not know legal terminology, did not know court procedure, did not know how to draft a petition, but she knew how to read numbers, knew how to recognize when a number was lying, and knew how to bring evidence to the right person at the right time. The rest was Whitfield's job. He looked at the files, looked at Mara, then picked up the phone and made 3 calls within 20 minutes. The transaction was frozen before lunch. The news reached Barrett through Sully that afternoon, and when Mara returned to the mansion that evening, she found Barrett in the living room, sitting in his familiar armchair, looking as exhausted as always, but his eyes carried something different, something Mara had to look closely to recognize, because it was buried beneath his usual control. But it was there, clear as firelight reflected on glass. Pride. Not loud pride, not praise, not some grand declaration. Only the way his eyes followed her when she entered the room, sat down in the chair across from him as she did every night, opened the financial ledger, and continued reading as if she had not just blocked a $1 million transaction and protected dozens of families she had never met. Silence stretched for several minutes. Then Barrett spoke, his voice lower and gentler than usual. "Thank you, Mara." She looked up. He was not looking at her but at the file in his hand. Yet the word that had just left his mouth was still hovering between them like something that had changed shape and could not be taken back. Mara. Not Meredith. Not Miss Ashford. Not you, with the polite distance he had maintained since the first day. Just Mara. One syllable had been removed, and the distance that syllable carried disappeared with it. Mara looked at him for one more second, then returned to the ledger in her hand. "It's nothing," she answered softly, and they both went back to reading in silence. But the silence tonight was different from every night before it. It was warmer, closer, and carried the weight of a new name. Because when the right person says a name the right way, it can change everything. The first wave of nausea came one morning, a week after Mara blocked Paige's transaction, arriving so gently that she thought it was only because she had forgotten to eat dinner the night before. But it came back the next morning, and the morning after that. And by the 4th day, when she was standing in the kitchen making coffee and the smell of the coffee she had brewed every morning for 3 months suddenly turned her stomach inside out, she set the cup down on the counter and stood frozen, both hands gripping the edge of the stone counter, while the thought she had been trying to push away for 4 days finally stood upright in the middle of her mind and refused to be pushed aside one more time. She bought a test at the pharmacy on the way back from Knox's hospital, hid it in her coat pocket, and waited until the mansion had gone completely silent late that night before stepping into the bathroom and locking the door. The white light in the bathroom was colder than any other light in this house, and Mara sat on the edge of the tub, staring at the test lying on the sink while the 3-minute wait stretched into 3 hours. When 2 lines appeared, she couldn't breathe for several seconds. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something much larger than fear. Something she had no name for because she had never felt it before. She looked at the test and heard Knox's voice echoing inside her head. His voice from the day he sat in the hospital bed and looked at her with eyes older than his years. "Have you ever wanted to keep something for yourself?" Mara placed a hand on her stomach, lightly, as if afraid that pressing too hard would make the thing inside her disappear. And for the first time in 27 years, the answer to Knox's question was yes. Yes. She wanted to keep this. Not because of Barrett, not because of the agreement, not because of the will or the assets or the Kincaid organization, but because this was the first thing in her life that belonged to her, not because of duty or survival, but because it simply existed inside her, and she wanted it there. The next evening, Mara found Barrett in the living room. He was sitting in the armchair beside the window, watching the snowfall, and she realized with a quiet ache that he was thinner than he had been last week, his collarbones sharper beneath the neck of his shirt, and the hair at his temples much more silver than it had been the day they first met in the study. Not silver from age, but silver because chemotherapy was quietly taking pieces of his body away, one by one, in ways he never mentioned. Barrett turned when he heard her footsteps, and his eyes softened in the way they now only did when he looked at her, the way the Kincaid boss would never let anyone else in the world see. Mara sat down beside him, closer than usual, and said nothing. She took his hand, gently, then placed his palm on her stomach. Barrett froze. His hand lay motionless on her stomach as if he were afraid that moving would break something he had not dared believe was real. He looked down at his hand. Then he looked up at her face. And Mara saw his eyes slowly redden, like ink seeping into paper. But no tears fell. Barrett Kincaid didn't cry. His jaw clenched so tightly she could see the tendons rising along both sides of his neck, and his hand on her stomach began to tremble, trembling hard, trembling the way a body trembles when it is trying to carry an emotion too large for any control to hold. Then he lowered his head. His forehead rested against her shoulder, heavy and warm, and he released one long breath, a breath so deep and drawn out, it was as if he had been holding it for years. And this was the first time his lungs had been allowed to open completely, even as illness was destroying them day by day. Mara placed her hand on his head, her fingers touching his hair where black was giving way to silver. And she held him there, his forehead on her shoulder, his hand on her stomach, in the room where snow fell white beyond the window and the fireplace burned warm inside. "I'll fight," Barrett said, his voice rough and breaking at the edges of every word in a way Mara had never heard before. The voice of a man saying the most important thing in his life, with the last breath he was willing to spend. "Not for me." For this, Mara didn't answer. She didn't need to. She only held him closer while the snow kept falling outside and time kept moving on. And both of them knew time was not on their side. But in that moment, just that moment, it didn't matter. 6 months passed, not like a river, but like the tide, with some days rising full of hope, and other days pulling back to reveal the bare sandy floor of reality. Barrett fought the way he did everything in his life, silently, stubbornly, and never letting anyone see him in pain. Chemotherapy happened regularly every 2 weeks at the private clinic, and each time he returned to the mansion, he looked a little thinner, his eyes a little more sunken, but he still wore a suit, still sat down at his desk, still read files until his eyes could no longer hold the words, and only then allowed his body to rest. There were weeks when he was strong enough to walk slowly around the mansion grounds with Mara, his steps heavy on the earth where the snow was beginning to melt and give way to wet patches of grass beneath, and weak sunlight slipped through the clouds and fell over the two of them, making them look like a painting someone had tried to finish quickly before running out of paint. There were weeks when he didn't leave the bed, and Mara sat beside him reading financial files aloud because he wanted to know everything was still running even while his body was stopping. Mara managed the legal assets now, not like an apprentice, but like someone who had begun to understand that every number in the books represented whether some family on the South Side would have a place to live or not, would receive free medical care or not, would survive the winter or not. She kept the basement clinic running, stayed in contact with the volunteer nurses, made sure medicine was fully supplied, and every time Paige tried some new move, Mara and Mr. Whitfield blocked it before it could take root. Then, one weekday morning, Mara received a call from the hospital while she was standing in the kitchen. Knox's kidney transplant had been successful. She stood still with the phone pressed to her ear, listening to the doctor talk about recovery numbers and follow-up schedules after surgery, and when the call ended, she lowered the phone, looked around the empty kitchen, then sat down on the floor. Not because her legs were weak, but because something inside her had just been untied after years of being bound tight, and it needed space to escape, and the cold kitchen floor against her back was the only place real enough to hold that moment. Mara laughed, truly laughed. Not the restrained smile she gave Knox through the hospital room glass, not the polite smile she wore in front of the staff, but a sound breaking out from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere she had locked away on the night she lost her parents and had forgotten the key. Barrett passed the kitchen, his steps slow because today was not a good day in the alternating pattern of good days and not good days, and he saw her sitting on the floor, her back against the kitchen cabinet, her eyes wet, but laughing. He didn't ask what had happened. Didn't ask whether she was all right. He only walked to the counter, poured a glass of water, set it on the floor beside her, then walked out of the kitchen without looking back. The glass of water stood still on the tile beside Mara, and she looked at it and laughed again, laughing because that dying man still poured water for her when he saw she was thirsty, even though he didn't know whether she was thirsty from grief or joy, and he didn't need to know. He only needed to pour. That was how Barrett loved. Never by saying it, only by doing. Fresh fruit appeared beside the breakfast table every day, even though Mara had never said she liked fruit, but Barrett had seen her eat an apple in the kitchen during the first week. And from then on, there was never a day without it. Books for expectant mothers began appearing on the shelf in her room, not in a large pile that would draw attention, but one at a time, placed gently beside the one before it, with no note and no mention. The cashmere blanket he had once draped over her the night she fell asleep on the sofa now waited over the back of the chair, near the door to the courtyard. and every time Mara stepped outside into the cold wind, she found it there waiting for her, as if it somehow knew she would come. Barrett Kincaid never said the word love. He didn't say it because he wasn't that kind of man, or because he feared the word was too small for what was growing inside him, or because he knew he was dying, and saying love before leaving would be crueler than not saying it at all. But he loved through the glass of water on the kitchen floor, through the morning fruit, through the books on the shelf, through the cashmere blanket waiting by the door. He loved with everything except words, and Mara heard all of it. Barrett passed away on a spring morning, just as the last snow of winter had melted into small pools on the bedroom windowsill, and the first sunlight in months slipped through the thin curtains, laying a pale golden streak across the white blanket, where their hands were intertwined. Mara knew this day would come. She had known from the moment she saw the blood-stained handkerchief in the study on the first day, known from the way his voice weakened after each week, known from the way he slept more than he stayed awake, and the way their walks around the courtyard grew shorter after every attempt, until they became only a few steps from the bed to the window and back again. She had known, but knowing didn't mean being ready, because no one in the world is ever ready for the moment when the hand holding theirs suddenly grows lighter. During the final week, Barrett no longer left the bed. The doctor came every day and left with the face Mara had learned to read back when she was a nurse, the face that said medicine had done its part, and whatever remained now belonged to time. Mara moved the financial files to the small table beside his bed and worked there, so that whenever Barrett opened his eyes, he would see her sitting close. And sometimes he opened his eyes and looked at her, then closed them again without saying anything, only looking as if he were storing the image of her somewhere deeper than memory, somewhere death couldn't reach. On the night before the final morning, Barrett woke at 3 o'clock and searched for her hand in the darkness. Mara was sitting in the chair beside the bed, not asleep, and the moment his fingers touched hers, she took his hand at once, like a reflex her body had learned by heart, after months of holding this man's hand through long nights. "Mara," he said, his voice now only breath-shaped into sound. She leaned closer. "I'm here." He said nothing else. He only squeezed her hand gently, then closed his eyes, and Mara sat there listening to his breathing in the dark, counting each breath the way she used to count Knox's breathing on the nights when his fever ran high in the basement apartment, except this time she wasn't counting to check. She was counting to remember, because she knew each breath now was a gift time was lending her and would take back before sunrise. Morning arrived slowly. The light changed from gray to silver to pale gold, and when the first streak of sun touched the blanket, Mara felt Barrett's breathing change. Slower, lighter, the space between each breath longer than the one before, like rests in a piece of music where the player was gradually setting the instrument down. Then he opened his eyes. For the last time, his dark brown eyes looked straight at her, and they held none of the exhaustion or pain or fear Mara had grown used to seeing over the past many months. They held quietness, the kind of quietness of a man who had seen enough, done enough, loved enough to let go without regret. He didn't say anything. Neither did Mara, because they had already said everything that needed to be said over 6 months, through morning coffee, through ledgers read aloud, through fruit on the table and a cashmere blanket by the door, through a forehead resting on a shoulder, and a hand on the stomach that carried the child he would never meet. Words now were only empty shells, too small to hold what was spilling between them in the first sunlight of spring. Barrett squeezed her hand gently, more lightly than ever before. So lightly Mara almost didn't feel it. Then he let go, not because he wanted to, but because his fingers no longer had the strength to hold on, and that letting go happened slowly, one finger at a time, like petals falling from a branch, not because of the wind, but because the time had come. Mara kept his hand inside hers for a very long time afterward. The room was completely still, no breathing, no heartbeat monitor, because Barrett had asked for the machines to be turned off the week before. Only silence, and sunlight, and the last warmth on his skin slowly cooling beneath her palm. Mara sat motionless. She looked at Barrett's face in the spring light, and realized this was the first time she had ever seen him without pain. No clenched jaw, no hidden cough, no exhaustion layered beneath control. Only peace, the kind of peace she wished he had been allowed to feel while he was still alive. Then Mara cried. For the first time in her life, she cried in front of another person, even though that person could no longer hear her. The tears did not come violently. They came slowly, one drop at a time, falling onto the hand she still held in hers, and her crying wasn't sobbing. It was the silent sound of someone who had kept everything inside for too long, and finally had no reason to hold it in anymore, because the only person she wanted to be strong for had already let go of her hand. Outside the bedroom door, Sully stood still. No one knew how long he had been there, his back against the hallway wall, his hands folded in front of his chest, and when Mara's soft crying slipped through the half-closed door, Sully Voss, the man who had walked beside Barrett Kincaid for 20 years and never looked away from anything, turned his face away. 1 month after Barrett Kincaid passed away, Mara stood in the study that was now her study. The walnut desk still sat in the same place. The desk lamp still cast its pale yellow light across half the tabletop the way it had when Barrett used to sit there, but the person behind the desk, now, was a woman of 27, with dark brown hair tied neatly behind her neck, the shadows beneath her eyes lighter than they had been on that first night when the knock sounded at the basement apartment, and her stomach clearly rounded beneath the gray sweater Barrett had once placed on the shelf in her room, without saying a single word. Spread across the desk were files that 6 months earlier she hadn't known how to read, and now she understood every number. The contract to expand the basement clinic on the south side into 2 facilities, the paperwork establishing the scholarship fund named after Barrett's mother that Mara had signed the week before, the renewal documents for the affordable housing complex that would guarantee poor families no rent increase for the next 10 years. Sully stood by the door, where he always stood, silent and loyal. But now he took orders from her, not because the will said so, but because he had seen her kneel on the basement floor and tell Barrett to stand up, had seen her stop Paige with ledgers and lawyers, had seen her hold Barrett's hand until the final minute, then stand, wipe away her tears, and return to the desk the very next afternoon. Paige had been removed from the board of directors, not with evidence Barrett had left behind, because he hadn't had any, but with evidence Mara found herself 2 weeks after Barrett died, when she sat alone in the study at 2 o'clock in the morning, checking ledgers from 5 years earlier, and discovered that Paige had been taking money from the community fund for years through dozens of small transactions, each one small enough not to draw attention, but together large enough for Mr. Whitfield to present to the board without any need for argument. Barrett had chosen the right person. Not because she was strong, but because she knew how to look at the details other people missed, a skill she had learned not from business school but from nights on duty at the hospital, when one shifted number on a monitor could save a life or lose one, depending on whether someone had enough patience to see it. Mara pulled open the right-hand drawer and stopped. An envelope lay at the bottom, flattened beneath an old notebook, and she recognized the black handwritten ink on its face immediately, because she had seen that handwriting once before, on the label of the USB drive from the first night. She opened the envelope with a hand that trembled slightly, and inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting leaning to the right in the way of a left-handed man trying to write carefully. Meredith, I wrote the first proposal out of desperation. I'm writing this one out of love. You turned this dead house into a place worth living in during the final months of my life. Don't carry any new scars. You've carried enough already. Let the child know that their father was once a bad man, but tried to become better because of their mother. Mara read the letter twice, then 3 times. Then she folded it carefully along the old creases and held it against the left side of her chest for several seconds, where her heart beat steadily beside the much smaller heartbeat growing inside her. She placed the letter back into the drawer, at the bottom, exactly where Barrett had hidden it, because some things belonged more to quiet darkness than to noisy light, and this letter was the last conversation between 2 people that no one else needed to hear. Mara placed a hand on her stomach and looked out the window. Outside, the last snow of the season was melting into water that ran down the mansion roof, each drop falling steadily onto the windowsill like a clock counting down, but this time it wasn't counting toward an ending. It was counting toward a beginning. Spring sunlight shone through the oak tree that had begun to push out pale new leaves, and the light entering the study was warmer than any fireplace Mara had ever sat beside inside this house. For the first time since the night a knock sounded in the basement apartment on the south side, since the USB drive in the dark, since the wedding with no flowers, and the box of scar cream outside her bedroom door, and the cup of coffee at 6 o'clock in the morning, and the snowstorm night in front of the fireplace, and the trembling hand on her stomach when he heard about the child, and the final morning when his fingers loosened from hers. For the first time after all of that, Mara Ashford did not feel afraid. Mara and Barrett's story ends here, but the lesson it leaves behind does not. Sometimes in life, Love does not come with roses and vows, but with a glass of water placed on the kitchen floor when someone sees that you are thirsty, with a box of scar cream left outside your bedroom door when someone remembers that you are hurting, with small actions repeated every day without needing to be spoken aloud. A person's dignity is never defined by the amount of money in a bank account or the address where they live, and true strength is not, never falling down. It is standing up every time you fall, even when no one applauds. If this story touched your heart, please press like so more people can find it, and share it with someone you believe needs to hear that strength sometimes looks very different from what we imagine. Please subscribe to our channel to listen to more emotional stories every day. We would truly love to know how you felt after hearing this story. Which part made you pause and think? Which character touched you the most? So please leave a comment below, because every share from you is the greatest motivation for us to keep telling stories that touch the heart. I wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.